Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion, the time where we do our best to factor the truth of God's Word into our and hopefully your daily lives. Yes, sometimes we'll make silly comments and we'll joke about this and that, but when it comes to the Word of God, we approach it with all seriousness, and it is our goal to make certain that we understand it in the context of the Scriptures which God has given to us. Now, we are in an interim study as we prepare for our next book study, which will be one of the gospel accounts. And in this interim study, we are looking at lessons learned by preachers. Last week, episode 197, we began the study. And in that particular study, some of the key lessons we talked about had to do with what are the qualifications of those who would proclaim the Word of God. We talked about the need to preach only the Word of God. And then we talked about preaching your own understanding. Preach your own belief. Don't preach what others tell you to preach, but preach what you understand and see within the Scriptures. And so in just a moment, we'll continue with that study. But before we do, we have Wayne back with us today. Wayne, how are you getting along?
Oh, well, the weather is considerably colder where I am now. We've been transitioning up to Minnesota for those joining us, and now that transition is basically complete. We are moved into our new house, and I am now working with a congregation up here. And I ask your prayers as we continue endeavoring with the brethren here. I have a lot of high hopes for the work here.
Wonderful. Well, it's good to have you back with us, Wayne. Good to have you back. Let's see. If you notice that down at the lower portion of the hangout window, you've got one bar or one box that has test patterns. I'll try to replace it next week with an actual logo, but what we're going to try to do is something a little bit different today. And I'll show that to you as we get along with our study. All righty, let's see. Gentlemen, is there anything that we need to bring out before we continue? Anything that you
John,
maybe
I'd like
wanted
to
to?
let the folks know that if you're watching us at live.truthfactor.com and you'd like to participate, if you would just maybe use the guest login or one of the social media logins, you would be able to make comments and ask questions. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can make a comment on that video window, and we try to introduce those as we study together as best we can. Sometimes we get involved in discussion and they come in a few minutes later, but we do our best to make sure that your comments are brought forth, and if you have questions, that we do our best to answer those as well.
All righty, thank you, Paul. I appreciate you clarifying that. I had forgot and was about to run right over that important announcement. We don't have, for whatever reason, I'm not able to properly log in to vMix Social that would let me share the Facebook comments, so we won't share them on screen, but we'll bring them to the study, as Paul said. But if you're in the live.truthfactor.com, we can still bring those in on the screen. All right, so here's what we were looking at last week, kind of an overview, as we've already talked about. The idea is lessons learned by preachers. And just for clarification's sake, we know that many people preach the word. We understand that. But we're talking about the specific group that lives of the gospel, those individuals who have decided to spend their life being supported by local congregations as they endeavor to work locally with congregations and to preach the Word of God. And we're going to be starting with our fourth lesson that preachers learned. And this one, we asked all the hosts here, all of us guys, to kind of put forth the lessons that, one or two lessons that they've learned. And so the next one we're going to bring up here, Brian, I think belongs to you. And let me get that set for you. There you go, Brian.
All right. Thank you very much, John. Years ago, when I first went into preaching, I had been working in a secular work for some time, and I had also spent some time as a deacon and was transitioning over to becoming a preacher when an older preacher approached me and gave me some advice that I just thought was absolutely invaluable. And what he had to say was, Brian, you've got to make sure your family, your physical family, is a priority in your life. That too often it's too easy for preachers to neglect their families because they get caught up in the things of the brethren, and to some degree not to shield or protect their families from things that sometimes come up within churches. Now, what I mean by that is, and what this preacher meant by that, is that preaching can be a difficult thing sometimes. We might consider in the Old Testament that oftentimes when men were called to be prophets, that was a very, very hard lifestyle. Maybe somebody like Ezekiel, and we think of all the different things that he had to bear as a burden. How many times does the expression come up in the Old Testament, the burden of the word of the Lord? And that's an important thing for us to understand, that it can be a burden to have to explain or to bear things to other people. In the New Testament, we notice a number of times where Paul is talking to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 3, and again in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 5, and in both times he expresses to Timothy the understanding that it can be difficult to be an evangelist. In chapter 2, he speaks about the hardship that there will be, and in chapter 4, he speaks about the afflictions that would come. And it's important for us to understand, especially if somebody is contemplating the work of becoming an evangelist, that the idea is that it will be difficult. It's not an easy job. It's not something you can just do and just, get by with. That it actually comes with a great deal of difficulty and burdens, especially if we're committed to being effective and qualified and appropriate in our behavior and such. But really the focus I would like to take a moment to talk about is the focus of what that does with our families and how important it is that we understand that. When I became an evangelist, one of the conversations that we had a lot was between my wife and I, was what would her expectations be to be the preacher's wife. Of course, there is no such office or work like there is maybe a deacon's wife or even an elder's wife in scriptures. And yet we understood that there would be expectations placed by brethren on the preacher's wife. And indeed, I suspect that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5, when Paul is speaking about his right to bring along a believing wife, that the point is that some brethren might not have seen that as something that he had a right to do. If he had had a believing wife, that he might not have had that right to bring her along with him. So to that end, it's important that we understand, and that brethren understand, that being the preacher's wife can be a very difficult burden at times. There are both expectations and views placed upon them that are oftentimes unfair or that aren't easy to bear with. And it's good for brethren to be mindful of how difficult that might be. It's also to be understood that not just our spouses, but our children are also placed under a type of scrutiny and behavior that's rather unique, especially since oftentimes we're presenting messages, important things that people need to hear. And when people hear something they don't like, what they want to do is they want to find fault with the person who said it. And if they can't find fault with them, they'll find it with their family. We've probably all heard stories of somebody who says, the preacher got up and said this, but his kids do that. It's that switching of that characteristic to judge them unfairly that a lot of times brethren can be guilty of doing. And again, it's just a way that sometimes we behave. The Bible speaks about the importance of fathers not provoking their children to wrath, and it's important for us both as evangelists to understand how dealing with our children needs to be something that they are a priority, and bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord in some ways takes a degree of precedence over our work. And that sometimes is something we don't always see or understand, but that they are first and foremost our charge by God, that's the thing we care first for. And so by doing that, by observing that, as this older preacher told me so long ago, make sure your kids are a priority in your life, that they are, one of the top priorities of your life was the point he wanted me to understand. And finally, there'd be the point to say that even in our extended family, sometimes things come up. A lot of times when you put on the work of an evangelist, that changes your relationship with some family members. They become less comfortable with you, or they struggle to accept you quite the same way, and they feel a little bit different about you. A lot of times your secular friends look at you differently, that they have a thought about how to live with you and how to deal with you that changes too. As well, there are obligations we have to our extended family. For example, we know in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8 that it speaks about the importance of of our taking care of family. And one of the things is that becoming an evangelist is oftentimes a very fiscally unrewarding profession or pursuit, and it makes it more difficult to take care of those that we need to take care of, and that needs to be understood by a congregation and by our family as well. So in summary, the real point we're trying to say here is that a lot of times, both when men become evangelists as well as when congregations take on evangelists, it's not appreciated or understood the kind of burdens that their families are going to face, their wives, their children, or their extended relatives. It's important that anybody who's taking on that work understands that there is an expectation of a burden, of difficulty, and of hardships. And, you know, a lot of times I'll hear men who became evangelists without that understanding, and they're complaining about how difficult it is or how many double standards there are. And you know, oftentimes I realize they just haven't really appreciated what it is that they need to be looking at, or how it is they need to focus on this. At the same time, you hear a lot of times from brethren complaints about the evangelist, and a lot of times those things are centered around his family, and they're unfair and they're inappropriate. And that's a problem that brethren need to work on as well. I'll stop here and see if anybody has any comments or thoughts to bring up out of that.
Yeah, Brian, that was you know, a great observation. Some of the things that I think of in dealing with family, and this has to do with the burden, is one thing that sometimes brethren don't think about is distance. You know, a lot of times when a preacher takes on work, I know Wayne can relate to this when he's overseas, you know, as well as other things. But and me, I'm right now I am 15 to 1,800 miles away from my closest relative. And you know, sometimes brethren don't understand the struggle of a wife and kids who have to up and completely leave their families, and they may not get to see them for a year or so, or maybe even longer, depending on what happens. I also think of children when the preacher has to move from one congregation to another, and their school life is uprooted. And they may every 2 to 3 years have to develop a whole new set of friends. And we are depending on the brethren in our congregation to become our family while we are away from our physical family. And sometimes that is not an easy thing to do.
You know, Tom, I think you said some things that are just tremendously important there. For one thing, you're right about the distance. That's a big deal. That is for me, it's for you, and it's probably for Wayne. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but you know, now Wayne has moved across the country from, you know, I assume most of your family's back in Florida, Wayne, and that's a big distance. It was hard for me when I moved to Oregon with most of my family in Texas and New Mexico. And one of the difficulties is I have older parents that I really, you know, I have a lot of concerns about, and they're taking care of them, and it's really difficult. Travel's not easy. And of course, again, as an evangelist, I'm not exactly, you know, able to easily cover the expenses of travel too. So it really puts a burden on them, my extended family, to ensure that I'm doing what I'm obligated to do as their son, and taking care of that. The second thing you said, Tom, that I think also was just a tremendously important statement, was the need that preachers have to be a part of a church family. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of times brethren may not appreciate or understand that, and they kind of see a preacher as a tool or instrument of the congregation rather than a member of the congregation, needing of that membership, companionship from the congregation. Tom, I think that that's just an excellent observation of how ironically an evangelist may need that more than most, yeah. And yet sometimes we're kind of put at a distance because of the work that we're doing. We're seen as an outsider brought in or something like that. Tom, that was just a great observation. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and you know, building on the point that you made there, you know, trying to get that family. There have been congregations that have been burned by preachers that were uncaring or impersonal, or at least they seemed uncaring. I guess but I mean, they were impersonal individuals, and there have been preachers and their families. You know, even more so than the preachers, their families have been, for lack of a better term, burned by by the brethren that are supposed to be their family. And they just get tremendously hurt, so that when they move to another place, they're almost hesitant to get close to people within the family or within the congregation because of that. And obviously that's an unhealthy thing. Just this past Sunday night, I preached on Psalm 142, and one of the things that I brought out in that particular psalm is David is talking about no one cared for my soul. And I know that has a couple of different interpretations, but one of the things I dealt with was loneliness. And an observation to be made about loneliness is, I found somewhere a quote that said, loneliness is not necessarily not being around anyone, it's feeling alone. And a lot of times, the family, and even a preacher can do this when he's away, he can feel like he is alone, even though he's not. I think of Elijah. I'm the only one that cares for you, and he was corrected. He was correct. Said, no, there's 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee. But you can feel alone, and how do you convey that to the brethren in a way that doesn't sound self-serving? So it's an interesting observation.
That's a great observation, Tom. I really appreciate your thoughts. Eric, I think you had a comment or a question to bring up too.
Yeah, I just want to know what you guys' thoughts are on in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul talks about the married man has his interest divided. He can't be as completely devoted, to the work as perhaps a single person could. And given that, it seems like, do you agree that Paul is saying, as a married person, we have to take into consideration the welfare, the needs, the perspective of our wife as well. We can't just say, well, this is what I feel like is best, and it doesn't really matter, how that impacts you. Do you guys agree that that's implicit in what he's saying?
I would agree completely.
I have a kind of weird view of that passage, in which I think he's addressing both sides and telling them both that they need to discard their anxiety. But that discussion might take us pretty far afield of this discussion.
Yeah, in short summary, I would just say absolutely.
I was thinking, Brian, about this, and there is a responsibility. I'll talk about this a little later in this study, but there is a responsibility to be a good example, and so we need to do our best within our families for the man to be a good husband and father, his wife to be a good wife and a good mother, and the children to respond properly to their parents, but not to be held to an unfair level. And honestly, not every a man. Maybe I'm jumping too far ahead, but a young man who's considering preaching, he needs to talk with the woman that he's going to marry and see if she is going to be able to take on the pressures that are involved, and sometimes the instability or the difficulties that are involved in that, because it doesn't make her a bad wife or a bad woman, but not every wife is ready for that responsibility.
Paul, that's important. You said it doesn't make them bad. It is important to understand that if somebody says, hey, I'm able to speak publicly, does that mean I'm supposed to be a preacher? There's a lot of burden involved that maybe they need to consider that it's not something they need to do, and you don't have to do that. There are lots of ways to serve the Lord.
Yes.
So
Hey.
I guess I had a thought in all of this, and listening to the back and forth here. So my experience, I feel like, is a little different than some of the things you're describing. I feel like my overall preaching-wise, my family's been treated very well. I've generally been treated very well. There's probably, I can probably look back and go, well, there was this time where somebody slighted me or something like that. But, who can't do that? That's just silly to think that you're never going to get slighted in life. But I think one thing that kind of unites all of these problems together, or at least a lot of them together, when we start talking about the feeling that a preacher is, this outsider to the rest of the congregation, or this idea that his children are constantly having to reform every relationship they have every 2 to 3 years, or that his wife has to reform every relationship she has every 2 to 3 years. at some point we have to stop and question this notion that the preacher should be moving every 2 to 3 years, because, and I mean, I can testify. I was at the congregation I was at for for over 7 years. I felt like it was hard to leave. The brethren there didn't want us to go, and we had but we had an evangelistic opportunity up here, and we decided to do that. But 7 years is, it's a time to form relationships and to be bonded together. And we weren't treated like this group of people that lived in a fishbowl. And I think that that's part of the perspective, is if all you're thinking of your preacher is this temp who's just going to be in and out, and you're just rotating them out like Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers, then, you're not going to form relationships with them. You're not going to establish this helpful, meaningful family type situation with them. And so that's something I think that, and some of you have experienced this. I think most of the people here have been with their congregations for a fairly long time. Am I right about that? Or, yeah. I mean, I don't know. My general impression is that the longer you can stay in a place and the longer you can build a relationship with the members of the congregation, the more fruitful your work will be, the better your family relationship there will be, the better a lot of things will be. If you're working on yourself and trying to be the best Christian and that you need to be. That's just my experience. I haven't had a negative family experience. I have made a point of, I've tried to take measures over the years. Like, one thing I'm very concerned about, for instance, is, if I go overseas to India, how does that affect my children? Make a point. I call every day. I start talking about, maybe there's some way we can all go together sometime as a family so that they can see the work I'm doing there, so that they can be a part of it even. I'm trying to be, and people say I'm just, there's some folks that say I'm just out of my mind for wanting to take a whole family to India. But, that's something to consider. And it's something, and even this move up to Minnesota, I wouldn't have done this if my wife hadn't been 100% on board with it. But I brought her up here, and we looked around, and by the end of it, I think that she was ready to go. She was very, very interested in the work up here, and loved meeting the brethren. And so, there's a lot of things like that. Just make sure your family's on board with what you're doing, but also make sure you build good relationships with the congregation, and vice versa. If you are part of a congregation, as a preacher, you are part of a congregation, but as congregations, we are obligated to fulfill Jesus' instruction to love one another as I have loved you, to not show partiality, to not indulge in these sins of the flesh that, enmity, dissensions, factions, divisions. When you cordon off the preacher's family and treat them like outsiders, that's a division, and that has no place among God's people.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
That's a great comment. And in fact, some of what you said there, it looks like Paul's going to be covering here in just a few moments. And we probably ought to pretty quickly here wrap up and move to John. But Tom, do you have one more comment, or does somebody else have one more comment to make?
Yeah, I wanted to make a quick observation about what Wayne said there. I don't want it to be misunderstood that we haven't been accepted as a part of the family here, because I know Wayne's point there. Actually, everywhere I've been, it's been a whole lot more positive than negative. But I know of the stories. I know of the examples and know of people who had the struggles, which is why you're bringing it up. And the one thing that I do understand, even the church here is my family, and incidentally, I have said that on more than one occasion. Numerous times I tell them that you all have accepted. We've been more accepted here than at other places that we have been, as far as that goes. So I fully understand how we've been assimilated, and we're a part of this church family. I've been here 22 years, which is long, for a lot of people's standard, and I'm very blessed by that. So, we're talking about families, and these are concerns that you just got to be aware of, because you never know how long you're going to be at a place and what the environment is when you're moving there.
Tom, that's a great comment. In fact, I might add that you know, a lot of times for our viewers, a lot of us have a lot of conversation outside of our time here. And I frankly say, I don't think any of the people on this panel ever complain about the people they work with. We all have great relationships with the people we work with. And I think that was a good statement to that end, Tom. And conversely, you know, we understand too that a lot of times it's not about the congregation's relationship. Sometimes the evangelist makes it difficult too. And that's as much our point as anything, that, you know, that needs to be overcome as well.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, when an evangelist comes in with the intent of stirring things up, you know, he wants to get there. He wants to be there to cause trouble. And he may not use those words, but when you, by what you do and the way you say what you say, start alienating people, then you can't blame anybody but yourself.
So one thing we might want to consider then, well, actually, we probably ought to just go ahead and move on. I believe our next point John has is going to be about dealing with double standard expectations. So I'm going to turn our forum time back over to John.
All righty. Thank you, Brian. I think some of what we are talking about probably serves as somewhat overlapping with these 2 points here. And one of the things that I have not been preaching long by comparison to others. If Mike Davis was on here, he would be the longest preaching of us. But we've been doing this for about 31 years. And you know, and Wayne makes, in our private chat, Wayne brought up an interesting point. You know, do we really know what we're talking about if we've not ourselves, who are talking, faced these difficulties? The reality is that depending on where you preach, you do face problems, and you might be the problem. I love that comment that was made a while ago. If you have a preacher that says, "Hey, I'm coming into this new work, I've got a bunch of new ideas, and we're going to turn this church around, and we're going to make it the best it's ever been," he's not the leader of the church. He needs to dial it back. But anyway, the point of double standard is something that we did encounter. Unfortunately, when you're younger, you're not quite certain of how to handle everything. You definitely would handle things differently 30 years later than you would have when you first began to preach. But in the aspect of preaching, we live within a world that is created, for all intents and purposes, a preaching industry. I mean, it is considered a profession. And so as a result, there are some expectations, and this goes kind of back, like I said, piggybacking on what Brian was talking about. There are some expectations that fall upon the ones. And, you know, some preaching training programs, they do a wonderful job. But, you know, if we say, okay, here's what the world is going to expect of you, so you need to dress like this, behave like this, you need to be able to do this, your wife needs to be able to cook, she needs to be able to have be hospitable, she needs to be able to do A, B, C, and D. You know, it's kind of like, okay, here is the package of what we want from the preacher and his wife. But we as members, well, we're not held to that same standard. Now, I'll say, just like Tom has clarified, where I'm currently at, we don't have this problem. And I don't know if I would say that we did if we did, but we don't. So trust me on that one. But there are times where it's like, well, when is the preacher and his family going to do it? So you got sometimes a double standard that might arise. You expect more out of them than you do yourself as a member. But then you think about preachers' kids. You know, preachers' kids become the joke, just like elders' kids become the joke. And I determined before Ron and I ever had kids that I would never tell my children, do my best to never say to them, look, you just need to do this because you're a preacher's kid. You know, well, everybody else can do it. I know, and it's fine, but if you do it, you're going to make the members mad. The members are going to get upset at you, so I don't want you doing it because you're the preacher's kid. That's a wrong standard, because it just goes to add to that concept that there's a different behavioral expectation on the part of the preacher and his family. And again, I've not gone through this very much, so I am speaking from some experience. More earlier on than later on. But at the same time, I know I have heard stories of preachers where it's a lot worse. And they do tell their kids, look, you're a preacher kid. You know, you need to just finally admit it and behave this way. And that's not it. Maybe sounds like I'm rambling a little bit, but let's see. Anyone have any thoughts or comments about that? I tell you what, let's do this the fun way. How about you, Brian? You have any thoughts or comments?
No, I think you've said some things very well, and like you say, it does. These ideas do kind of fall in there, and they do kind of follow the thoughts of what are our expectations, and setting those double standards is an important point of that. So I really don't know if I have much else to add to it. I'm just thinking about some of the things we've said.
Well, I do have to be careful because I don't want to sound like that I'm griping to the world about the life that I've lived. Because we have been very blessed by God, but it's a reality. With like Brendan, sometimes Brendan's just getting started. And I wonder if anyone has pulled him aside and says, "Listen, son, we need to have a long talk. I want to share some horror stories with you."
Well, and for me,
not.
to have that preacher pull me aside, he wasn't so much advising me of what the brethren would do. He was advising me of what I would do. And he said, "Brian, you've got to make sure you're not, putting your family aside, or that everybody else comes first. They need to be first." And I really felt that was important.
If your kid has an important choir concert and a member calls you at the last minute and says, "I need to talk to you," you tell them, "I can't do it until after the concert."
That's a great example. I think that's actually that's an example you ought to share with everybody. That really needs to be understood by preachers, by brethren. That's the way it has to be.
I heard a story years ago, and then I thought I'll stop talking. We'll thought someone else, and this preacher's done passed on, but tragically, that was one of the things that his family observed about him. No matter what they had planned, no matter what event, if he got a call from one of the men, he was gone. And that's sad. Okay, I'm sorry. Someone was about to speak up there.
Well, no, it's just, to that point, if our job as evangelists, what is the most important and time-consuming task of evangelism that we will ever do, most of us? Well, it's our work as fathers, discipling our children, evangelizing to our children. We have a captive audience for, nearly 2 decades. If we can't convert them in 2 decades, what are we doing going around trying to snip at other people an hour at a time? It's something to think about, I think. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who can be effective while still somehow failing to raise their children. But don't fail to raise your children. That's the big one.
Yeah. For clarity's sake, I meant choir at school.
That's not the first time choirs have come up on the show. I'm just saying.
That's a good point. All right, Eric, you had a thought.
Most of my audience is in a choir. Now, I was going to say that, as far as the double standard goes, there is some truth to that. And I think we ought to recognize this, that it's fair and it's right for preachers to be held to a higher standard. And we see this, for instance, when Paul writes to Timothy, he says, "Set the believers an example." And elders are, some of their qualifications are that they have to have their house in order. And, people should be able to look to certain people among them. If you're in a position of leadership, you should be leading by example. And people ought to be able to see that your life is an example to follow in terms of being a Christian. And there's quite a few statements like that in the New Testament. Someone could be a member of a congregation and be wrestling and really struggling and having a hard time, and some particular sin has really got a grip on them, and they're just struggling, trying to, and they they're welcome to be there. We're going to encourage that person. But that person shouldn't be in the pulpit. And someone could have, kids who are just absolute, going through some kind of horrible train wreck or whatever. And, that doesn't mean they can't be a Christian, but they may not be qualified to be an elder. And so there is the double standard in terms of who is going to be held up as, an example to follow. And preachers need to embrace that. We need to understand that people are looking to us to not only be teaching and preaching, but to be living by the word as well. And that's actually that really comes before the whole teaching and preaching thing, that you should be living the path as well before you start trying to instruct others on how to walk it.
Well, I don't disagree with that. And that's kind of I guess what I'm saying is, you tell your child, you don't do this because you're a Christian, not because you're a preacher's child,
Right, exactly.
If it's a matter of maybe judgment, and they're doing something might cause a brother to be overly upset, then you might say to them, listen, I don't want you to do this because you're going to cause an issue for this brother, and it might cause them to sin. But you're absolutely right. I mean, when it comes to living right, we're no better than the members of the congregation, but we all live by the same standards. But sadly, oftentimes the elders and preachers are lifted up, and I mean, if anyone is going to serve God faithfully, it should be us. But I don't even like that statement. Obviously, we're all.
But I think
all
I don't know, John. I think that's biblical though to say that. Paul talks about look to those who are walking according to the example you have in us, and follow their example. I mean, there should be people in the group who are leading by example. You're never going to have a congregation unless you're just very rare. You're going to have a congregation where everybody's a fully mature Christian. So you're going to have people who have been at this a long time, who have greater understanding, who are supposed to be showing people how it's done. And then you'll have people who are struggling and going through, growing pains and they don't know, much about the Bible. And so I think we are supposed to be, leading by example.
I agree completely with what you're saying. But it's not a higher standard from what the members are supposed to live. And that's not what you're trying to say. Yeah.
Right. I agree. I'm sure we agree.
Yeah,
I think you might say it this way, is that the preacher needs to hold himself to a high standard, but all Christians need to hold themselves to a high standard.
Yeah. And, there might be times and situations where a preacher may make a choice on the side of caution just because it could ultimately affect his influence. I mean, there may be something like that a member may choose not to, but a preacher may say, yeah, I'm better not because I don't know.
And I'm sure you guys are aware of this, but I hear it all the time from my kids that they're connected via Instagram, via all these things with all the other kids.
Yeah.
And so they will say, well, you know what so-and-so did from the congregation. They're going here, they do this thing. I mean, they constantly compare what the other kids are doing and saying, and then use that as an example to say that they should do the same thing. And so that does put a great deal of pressure, I think, at least I feel it. And it creates some tension around here.
I think
I realize that what I do in my own house and what my kids do is not only what I'm doing and what they're doing, but there are other kids that know them, that look up to them, that are expecting them to set the standard too. And I think
that's right.
I don't know. That's probably where that whole preacher's kid pressure comes from, and there is a certain amount of that's inescapable. I think I don't know what the answer to it is.
Answer is preacher kids don't need to hang out with regular member kids. I'm kidding, but every Christian should be an example. But you're absolutely right. And any Christian parent should be able to say to their kid, "Look, you do the right thing. You set the example." But you're right. Paul does tell Timothy, and look up to those who. I agree with that. All righty. There's not much more I've got to say on the double standard. It was just more, hey, here's something you might want to think about, you may face. And so just consider it before you spend your life and dedicate your family to preaching God's word.
Yeah, John, just real quick, while you were mentioning that, just a humorous thought that came to my mind. Maybe we all have read about the ideal preacher. Remember that from times past, the standard where he's supposed to be, a certain 35 years of age with the vitality of youth, but the knowledge of an old man. Work on $100 a week, but yet drive a nice car, have nice clothes, and just all the opposites that aren't going to happen in one person at one time.
That was written for the days of televangelists, though. Now, if you're on TV, you can have your own private jet.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Well, if anyone else has any other comments, jump in real quick. If not, I'm going to throw it to Paul.
I'd be interested, because I know I think all of us here have kids, right? I'd be interested if any of the other you guys could give me, what do you think about the pressures you feel, or how do you communicate that to your kids?
Well, I mean, again, my experience is different than than some of the things that I've heard described. We tell our kids about what's going on, etc. But I'm not my son wandered into the basement a minute ago, and I asked him while the mic was muted, "Do you think it's hard being a preacher's kid?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I have to do the stuff you do." And I mean, he's 6, so that's his perspective. But I mean, I don't know what to make of it past that point. I do think that. I mean, I don't know. I just try to. I don't know how I would parent him any differently if I wasn't preaching, or whatnot. I mean, I would tell him, today we're going to do this. I'm going to a Bible study. I'm going to take you along with me. But I mean, my dad wasn't a preacher, and he took me to Bible studies with him all the time. So that wasn't really an odd thing for any kid, I think.
Eric, I have all my kids are out of school. Hannah's in college. Jonathan's about the same age. He's not in college. Josh is about to be 28, and Julia's a special situation, but she's 24. And I do talk to them about that they're held to a higher standard, and that people will judge our family more harshly sometimes. I'm not complaining. I don't feel like it's, like we have this big burden on us, but, I'm careful about that. I'm careful to protect them too from that, that they're not an overabundance of pressure put up on them, but that how we conduct ourselves, each member of the family, myself, my wife, that it impacts, people look at the church, however the members look at it, I don't know, but people look at the church differently because we represent that in many ways. We're the public face in some ways of the local congregation here, and so we have to be careful about that.
Is that good, Eric?
I do think it's a weight on their shoulders. I don't mind it, but I do sense that it may be a weight on their shoulders.
Yeah. I'm in kind of the same situation. I mean, Paul just talked about having five kids, and 3 of them are grown and married. 2 of them with kids are on their own. And I have one that just started college and one that's in the 7th grade. And we've been here for 10 years. We were in Lawton for 9 years. So much of their school age years were spent in those 2 locations. And there were kids, back in Lawton, and there were kids here and everything. And I must say, this double standard, and especially regarding preachers' kids, we really never faced, to that level. But I've just made the point to always tell them, yes, you're a preacher's kid, but you're a Christian first and foremost. And that should determine everything you do. Because what happens is they may say, well, if I wasn't a preacher's kid, I could probably get away with it. But since I'm a preacher's kid, I'm not going to be able to get away with it. And that's not the proper mentality. You'll always be a Christian, but you won't always be a preacher's kid. Maybe a way of looking at it. All right, let's see. Appreciate the question, Eric. That's a good one, definitely. All right, so Paul, I'm going to go ahead and bring you up on the screen there, sir, if you would like to take us into our next point. We have about 12 minutes left in our discussions. I think we could do this easily.
I think so. John and brothers, I just made the point in something that you learn is from some experience in preaching is that you need to truly care for those that you do work with. And it's been my experience that churches with their preacher will tolerate many shortcomings. They will overlook some things that, and even tolerate some things that you may not be the best public speaker. You may be like, especially as a young preacher, learning and having to sometimes come back and clarify points or whatever it is. But something they will not forgive and something that they will not look at you the same is if they ever get the impression that you really don't care, that you're just phoning it in, whether it's your public presentation or just your work as the preacher. You're not really sincere and you don't really care about those people that you work with. I mentioned there that it's evident to me that the Apostle Paul shows that, and I'll pull up the scripture here in Philippians chapter 1, that certainly there were congregations he was closer to than others. But when we look at that, there were congregations that really meant something very special to Paul as he worked with them. And he writes to the Philippians, and you recall how he addresses there it to the overseers and the deacons and the saints, to all the saints. And in verse 3, he says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers of me with grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of Christ Jesus. And it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. You notice there in verse 3, it makes kind of a nice sermon outline, that he had them in his heart. In verse 7, verse 3, he had them in his heart. In verse 7, he had them in, I said it wrong again, in his mind in verse 3, in his heart in verse 7, and in his prayers in verses 9 through 11. Paul cared about these people, and you notice how they wanted to share with him, and they gave to him out of their poverty sometimes. A similar relationship is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, if you look at Paul's relationship with these Christians. And so there is a saying that you may have heard, that people will not care how much you know until you know how much they care. That's just a man-made proverb. But I think there's a lot of truth there, that people really need to know how much we care as we work with them. And I made an additional note here when we were talking earlier, that unfortunately I have heard preachers sometimes go maybe far away or in a group of other preachers, and they begin to dog the congregation to others. That's such a terrible thing to do. We need to so highly value the relationship we have with the local congregation that when we speak of them, it's very positive. It's very, it's like we're talking about, well, it is that we're talking about our family, and they're not perfect, and they have their mistakes, but that we're not just saying, oh, can you believe these terrible people that I have to work with? I've never felt that way with any congregation that I've worked with, and I'd hope that other preachers have not had that experience. I wanted to make one other point, and that is that sometimes in the work of preaching, if I were to give a young man some advice, I would tell him that sometimes you need to do things that's not part of your job description. And I've heard preachers say, and they'll talk about certain works, and they'll say, oh, that's not my job to do. Because when we are fully supported in the gospel, sometimes our schedules can be flexible. And we may have to stay up late at night sometimes studying and working on things, but our schedule may be flexible so that we can be with that brother or that sister when they have surgery, or we can go be with a bereaved family right when the person passes away, and we can make a difference in their life and share the Word of God with them in those very stressful and difficult situations. And we can share a prayer with them, the work of prayer, and do that. And so instead of saying, that's not my job, that's something every Christian should do, maybe we should say, well, here's an opportunity that I can set an example. Several have quoted 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12. Be an example to the believers and show them how they should conduct themselves. And as you show that in your life, it's going to impact them, and they'll begin to show those things as you instruct them in those things as well.
Paul, I really appreciate what you said. It reminds me, too, one of the thoughts was one of the first advices I got from an elder when I started preaching. He said, Brian, you've got to love the brethren. And he says, if you love the brethren, you'll be effective, and you'll be valuable, and you'll fulfill your commission. And I think as you describe that, that is right on, to describe how it is we're supposed to have that affection. I really appreciate what you had to say there.
And as you look at that, there are, Brian, going to come some hard times that you have to teach some hard things to people. Maybe you see corrections that need to be made in the congregation. Well, if you come in there arrogantly and proudly and uncaringly, guns a-blazing, they're probably going to send you on your way without giving you a fair hearing. But if they know that as you bring this hard teaching, that it's hard for you to bring it because of your love for them, but that you're going to bring it, you're so committed to truth and to the Lord that you're going to preach these hard things, that I believe that they would be more likely to give that teaching a fair hearing and compare it with the Word of God and see if maybe there are changes that need to be made. When we think about those things, it's just sort of a practical lesson that maybe we can learn. Brian?
You know, I was just going to say, too, your other point was, you know, you do hear from time to time evangelists saying, well, you know, that's not my job. And I can understand that there's a danger of you know, falling into different works. But I recall my first work, I said, you know, I'm at the building all the time. Why don't I just mow the lawn? You know, and of course they said, well, you know, every preacher before you has said that's not their job and they won't do it. And a lot of men said, you know what, I'd like to study with you more, things like that. And it was over that simple thing. And I knew it wasn't my job, but I knew I could do it just as well as anyone. And I really appreciate what you said there. I think a lot of evangelists need to understand that fundamentally, if our job can have a lot of different ways to be accessible and to work. And that may include doing things that, you know, we might say aren't our job. And I really appreciate that statement.
I was going to say that there was a situation that I experienced in another place, and the brothers passed on, but he really did not care for me when I moved there. He, I think, tried to discourage me from moving to that local work. And in fact, after a while, and he saw that I was probably going to stay, he did leave for another congregation. And I took time one night, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back because I know that that's a danger that we get into. But when he had a heart attack, to go be with him in the middle of the night in a really bad neighborhood where this hospital was. And he was shocked that I walked through the door because he had left us, but I was close by and was able to see him. He eventually came back to that local work and was such a valuable member, as we say, a team player, on board with every good thing that we were trying to do. And sometimes you can take those who may not initially appreciate you, show your care for them and for their families, and in doing that, you turn an enemy into a friend, and you build a close relationship as a brother. And so I'd be happy to hear anything else anyone has to say. I know this is something that's sort of practical and maybe experiential, but I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, you know, first and foremost, as a Christian, you are a part of the congregation. Even, and I hesitate to say this, but even before you're the preacher, you know, and what I mean by that is, you know, you give the example of mowing the lawn and stuff like that. At the very least, you should go on the rotation if the men are doing it. You know, working on the building, you know, assimilate and just do your part. And I appreciate, like Brian said, if you've got the ability to do it all the time and so on, I mean, you're appreciated for it. But that's the bottom line: is become part of the body.
Well, see,
and that shows that you care about them.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I was bringing up a while ago, Tom, about the whole concept of the preaching industry. You've got some preachers who say, well, look, my job is to preach. I don't have to do anything else. I'm not going to mow the yard. I'm not going to water the plants. I'm not going to do anything. I come to my office, I do my work, and I go home. Don't bother me when I'm not here. And that's a horrible position.
Exactly.
So.
Oh, yeah, that's a horrible position.
I want you to treat me like I'm part of the congregation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
We know that Apollos watered. What's the deal?
I mean, yeah, there's certainly a lot to that. You know, I mean, the Bible has quite a bit to say about service towards one another, and doing those little acts of service here and there. That's not part of your job as the preacher. That's just, those are things that any Christian should be doing. But hey, last I checked, we fit into the category of any Christian. So
that's right. That's exactly right.
I mean, there you go, right?
Yep.
You know, one of our members said something that basically almost frightened me this past Sunday. Our congregation has shrunk recently, just as people have kind of moved away and various things have happened, and so the number of people we have that are available for certain jobs is lower than it used to be. And so this Sunday, for the first time in forever since I started preaching full time, basically, they had me down on the list to assist with the Lord's Supper, passing things around. And so I just haven't been put down for that. And so, it's no big deal. I did that. And anyway, somebody met me afterwards and said, "Hey, I appreciate you doing that because it shows that you're willing to, do these sort of things as well." And I thought to myself, I had no idea anybody would have thought that I wouldn't be willing to do that, but it is interesting how there can be this sort of perception. He said, well, normally preachers don't do that. And I thought it was interesting to me, but it does show there is this mindset, if we're not careful, that, we're above certain, service type roles. And we I think it's a dangerous to either buy into that, of course, or to feed that perception.
Okay. Paul, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I completed what I wanted to bring forth. I do think that if you're looking at, I guess we're supposed to get into advice for young preachers. I don't know if we'll do that today or not, but I would tell a young preacher that if you think that you'd like to be a preacher because you get to sit, on a throne and folks tell you how great you do every week, and there is work of service that if you're going to be successful with working with a local congregation, that will make all the difference. And if you think that, that's not my job, I'm not going to do those things, you might want to think about a different work to do.
Yeah. I hate to say.
Also, you might want to think about, hey, maybe this Christianity thing isn't. Again, service towards others is part and parcel of being a Christian at all.
Yeah.
You're going to go around telling people to become Christians, and you don't even want to be one yourself.
But
Yeah, it's fundamental.
But now, in all fairness, though, and I think this is one difference we've not really talked about. Being a preacher, you only work 2 days a week, so you're off the rest of the week. Not really, but your time management is a lot more flexible. So it may be that the preacher has more time to run to the hospital, whereas someone who's on his job for 12 hours a day, 4 days a week, may not have the time. There are certain variables like that to come into play. But I agree with Wayne, though. This is part of our role as Christians, and if we're failing, whether we are a preacher or not, we're still failing.
Right. My obligation to raise my children doesn't change because I choose to preach for a living or not preach for a living. My obligation to serve my brethren doesn't change based on that. My obligation to love my wife doesn't change based on that. And, we can criticize the double standards, but if we're going to say, well, I don't have to do any of that stuff and I'm all high and mighty, then, aren't we ourselves kind of engaging in a double standard?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, well, let me go ahead and bring the study back around for just a moment. We have gone through most of what we had set aside to talk about today. Tom had some thoughts on time management, and after that, we'll tell about some condos we have for sale. But, a plug, never mind. We don't really have any of that. I don't even know if we have time management figured out. But anyway, so we have time management to talk about. And then the other thing added to our outline kind of at the last minute was what would be our advice for men who are considering living of the gospel. And so, gentlemen, let me see what your thoughts are on this. We have one more week. Next week would be episode 199. And then after that is our 200th episode. And it's on that one that we're going to start our next book study. So, would y'all like to hold this over for one more week, Lessons Learned by Preachers Part 3, and maybe focus on maybe some time management suggestions, maybe some roadblocks that we have personally experienced when it comes to that, and then maybe some advice for men who are maybe considering this way of life?
I think, John, my opinion, which of course I always am happy to share, my opinion is that I would like for us to have a group discussion next week on those two questions maybe limit it to those two questions: advice for young preachers, and things that will help us, and things that are difficulties with time management. And I think that would really be beneficial time spent for those who may preach, or maybe for all Christians. But I would be in favor of stretching it and then wrapping up this topical study next Wednesday.
All right. Any other thoughts on that?
I agree.
Agreed.
Good to me.
Okay. All right.
Oh, sure. You let me go on and on. Everybody says, agree.
Paul
That's
always
still-
dominating discussion.
That's the way we roll. All righty. Well, I think our time is up. Wayne had a guest in his room, and they inadvertently stepped onto camera, so I hope everybody waved and everything. And so we'll... But we have gone to the end of our time period, and so we'll go ahead and pull the study to a close today. And I call it a study. It is. Some good scriptural points have been brought out, but what we're talking about, though, more hinges on life experience. And I know there are some preachers that have been preaching far longer, who may have had who might share different lessons with you. And the intent of our lessons weren't to say to the members, look at us, look how hard we have it, look how terrible our life is, please cut us a little slack. Nothing like that at all. But it does help the members to know what it is like, and the lessons that we have to learn as being those who live of the gospel. A number of years ago, when we were living in Jonesboro, I wrote an article for the bulletin, and in the article, and I don't remember what was on my mind. I think maybe I was venting a little bit, but it was kind of, life as a preacher, I've got to do this, and I've got to do this, and the woe is me, and I didn't realize how it came across until one of the men came up to me, and he came to my office. He says, "Okay, let's talk for a moment. What was really on your mind when you wrote this article? What were you really trying to say?" And so sometimes we might get into that mindset, and so we want to talk and we want people to listen, but more importantly, we want to do the work of the Lord. And if we're not effective, then we need to change. And we only can be effective if we work with a congregation of brethren who work with us. We work together as a group. There's no division there, as has been talked about. And so hopefully this may help share some insight into the scrambled brains that we have up here inside our skulls. All righty. Any other thoughts or comments? Let's go through this real quick. And Brian, we're going to start with you.
Nothing more to add. Appreciate everybody's thoughts. I thought some really great insight was given today, and I hope our listeners found it as profitable as I did.
All right, Eric?
I don't have anything to add either at the end here, and I also have benefited from what you guys have brought up and shared. Thank you.
Okay, Tom, any thoughts?
Very good discussion. Looking forward to concluding it next week.
All right, Wayne?
Likewise, I'm thankful to finally be back on the show, and I'm looking forward to next week.
All right, it's good to have you back, Wayne. And Paul?
I've enjoyed all of the points that have been made and benefited, and it's caused me to think, and just always appreciate you guys and the work that you do.
Okay. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us. We'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this period of factoring the truth of God's Word into our daily lives. If you're watching this later and have any questions or comments, feel free to let us hear them. You can send them to questions@truthfactor.com, and the word questions is plural. Questions@truthfactor.com. We want to hear from you. Lord willing, we will conclude this particular study next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
If you're in the United States in the Eastern time zone, that will be at noon.
9 a.m. on the Pacific Coast.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
And 2 a.m. in 1770.
That's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.